Welcome to At Home with Music, and we're continuing our series from medieval to modern. In this series, I'm giving an overview of the history of Western classical music. Now, Western and classical, these are inexact terms, and I've talked about what these terms mean in previous videos. And so these terms name a reasonably logical musical tradition that stretches from the Dark Ages all the way to the present day. Now, obviously, I'm not going to be able to go into detail about everything that I cover in this series. It's basically an overview. If I tried to go into detail about everything, then this series would become very unwieldy and it would be way too long. So my goal is to help you become familiar with the different periods and styles of classical music. We've covered the medieval period, where I talked about Gregorian chant, and we talked about the troubadours and the trouvères, and we explored some of the instruments that were used in the Middle Ages. We also studied the highlights of the Renaissance period, and so now in this video we come to the Baroque period. Now we're going to spend a little bit more time here because I want to break this study of the Baroque period into 4 sections, and this will cover the next 3 videos after this one. So in this video I want to talk about the Baroque period in general and talk about the rise of the solo voice and the opera. Then we'll talk about the religious music of the Baroque period. We'll talk about the rise of instrumental music and also keyboard music. And along the way, we'll highlight the work of some of the great composers of the Baroque period. The Baroque period goes from about 1600 to 1750. And those dates, of course, are always rough dates. There wasn't like a sharp dividing line between the Baroque and classical period. They kind of merged into one another. But there were 2 stylistic tendencies that defined the Baroque era. First, there was an increased interest in the solo voice as an instrument. In the earlier periods, there was a lot of group singing, a lot of madrigals and choir-type music. But there's solo singing in the Baroque period, and then also the rise of instrumental music. Now, the first of these, the rise of the solo voice, was born in Florence among a group of musicians and philosophers called the Florentine Camerata. And the word camerata literally means a chamber, a small group, like a chamber of commerce. Now I'm going to leave a link for an article, an in-depth article on the Florentine Camerata in the description. So you can do a little bit more research if you like. And this is one of those things, if I were to go into detail about the Camerata, then these videos would get very, very long, and we're just trying to give you the highlights. So what they sought to do was to create a form of stage music that was comparable to ancient Greek tragedy. They wanted to move away from the madrigals and the polyphonic writing, and so they created a new form of music which we now know today as the opera. And in opera, you had soloists who sang against an instrumental background. The earliest opera that has entirely survived is Eurydice. I got to make sure I pronounce that right. And it's by a member of the Camerata named Peri, and he lived from 1561 to 1633. And this opera represents the legend of Orpheus and Eurydice, and it was changed so that Orpheus successfully retrieves his wife from the underworld in a happy ending. In the actual myth, he doesn't succeed in doing this. So I'm going to put another link in the description about the real myth, the Greek myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, and you can learn a little bit more about that. I'm sure you can see by now that I am not able to go into great detail about all these things. The composer Henry Purcell wrote an opera called Dido and Aeneas. Dido and Aeneas. And that was to be performed by the students at a girls' school. So I'm going to leave a link to a little bit more about these famous operas so that you can listen to them. And in the next video, I'm going to talk about the religious music of the Baroque period.